I'm Elijah Carter, 26 godson and legal heir of Reverend Thomas Ellison. The church hall smelled like lemon oil polish and carnations, the kind that live a little too long in lukewarm water. Guests in pearl-colored suits and pastel dresses milled around inside, smiling at one another, while I stood just outside the double doors, holding a small white envelope that looked out of place against all the silver and gold trimming. A security usher in a navy vest blocked my way. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyes glancing down at my plain shirt, missing tie, and scuffed shoes. I held up the envelope. "I'm here for the baptism celebration, Ellison family. Reverend Thomas invited me." He scanned the guest list taped to a clipboard. I watched his finger move down the alphabet until it slowed, then stopped. "No Elijah Carter on this list," he said flatly, not even bothering to meet my eyes now. "It might be under Thomas Ellison. I'm his." I hesitated. Godson. That earned me a slight eyebrow raise. "Still, your name's not here. You'll have to wait outside." "Sir." Inside. Laughter erupted near the dessert table, and I caught sight of Thomas's grandchildren giggling while tossing Jordan almonds at each other. Beyond them, his eldest daughter gave a mock toast with a glass of sparkling cider, the crowd roaring with delight. And me, I was outside, fingertips damp from clutching the envelope too hard. "I'm not here to make trouble," I murmured, stepping back toward the low church wall. "I just wanted to hand this in person." The usher gave a mechanical nod and turned away. A gust of wind lifted the edge of the invitation card I had brought, the handwritten one Reverend Thomas gave me 21 years ago at my own baptism. I had kept it pressed between pages of a book all these years, faded blue ink, fragile creases. I could almost still hear his voice in the way he wrote to Elijah, whose life will not follow the crowd, but rise far above it. But apparently, none of that mattered now. I stood outside, watching shadows of the celebration play on the frosted windows. My hand flexed against the envelope one last time, tempted to just leave it on the welcome table and walk away. And then, the door burst open. A firm voice called out, "Elijah Carter." Everyone inside went quiet. Heads turned. Utensils stopped clinking. Even the children stilled like frozen frame shots. The man stepping through the doorway was tall, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit with the church seal embroidered in gold thread on his lapel. It was Bishop Ronald Mayfield, presiding authority over the entire county diocese. He stepped forward and said clearly, "I believe we've made a mistake." All eyes turned toward me as the bishop motioned for me to step inside. "Young man," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Reverend Ellison didn't just baptize you. He named you executor of his trust and beneficiary of a legacy he's guarded for years." This, he gestured to the card in my hand, was the first draft of something far greater. Gasps filled the room. Even the usher stumbled aside. "You're to be seated at the front table." Reverend Ellison made it very clear before he passed. "This young man is to be treated as family." I stepped inside slowly. Faces turned pale. A cousin's fork clinked onto her plate. Someone whispered my name like it was a question, but all I could hear was the sound of chairs being pulled back and space being made. To those of you watching this and feeling like you've stood at the door of something that should have belonged to you, whether it was a table, a title, or just some respect, I see you. If you've ever been the one excluded by your own so-called family, left outside despite everything you carry, I want you to drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Like this video if you've been through it. Subscribe if you've ever had to prove yourself to the people who should have known better. This story is for us. And this was the moment the room fell silent. When the laughter stopped. When every eye turned. When my presence, for the first time in years, could not be ignored. The silence inside the reception hall was thick enough to choke on. Even the chandelier seemed to hold its breath. Bishop Mayfield stepped aside, his gesture clear and unmistakable. The path to the center of the room had opened not just physically, but symbolically. I walked forward slowly, the soles of my shoes sticking faintly to the glossy floor with each step. The white envelope, still in my hand, felt heavier than it had before, like it was no longer just a card, but a mirror everyone was being forced to look into. As I passed the tables, I saw the faces of the Ellison family, some stiff with confusion, others unreadable. Thomas's eldest daughter, Marion, gave a tight-lipped smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her husband adjusted his collar, clearly unsettled. A few cousins I hadn't seen in years refused to meet my gaze, suddenly fascinated by their half-eaten slices of vanilla cake. At the head table, a seat had been left open, a tall, formal chair with dark oak arms and crimson cushion. I remembered it well. Reverend Ellison used to call it the thinking throne. He'd sit in it after service, stroking his beard, asking me questions no other adult ever had time for. Questions like, what's the difference between silence and peace? Or, how do you know if your faith is your own? I eased into the seat, and my heart gave a muted thump. For the first time since Thomas's funeral 2 months ago, I felt like he was in the room again. Bishop Mayfield stepped forward to address the crowd. Reverend Ellison left behind not just a ministry, but a philosophy, a legacy for those he trusted to carry his vision. This young man, he paused, placing a hand on my shoulder, was chosen not out of obligation, but out of belief. A belief in character, resilience, and truth. He let the silence stretch for a moment, then nodded. Let us proceed. The air shifted, and people returned to their seats. But it wasn't the same. Conversations resumed in hushed, cautious tones. I felt eyes on me like needles from every direction. No one offered congratulations. No one asked questions. But no one laughed anymore, either. As the catered meal was served, Marion leaned across the table, her smile now thin and brittle. That was quite the entrance. I returned the smile evenly. Wasn't my plan. Oh, I'm sure, she said, her eyes darting to the envelope still in my hand. What's in there? Anyway, a sermon. I opened the flap gently and pulled out the handwritten card, the same one they had all once mocked. I placed it on the table where the candlelight flickered against its fragile edges. Her gaze lingered on it, as if unsure whether to scoff or stay silent. I let her wonder. Later that evening, I excused myself and walked out to the courtyard, needing air. The garden lights bathed the walkway in a soft yellow glow. A few guests drifted about with champagne flutes and forced laughter, pretending nothing awkward had just happened. That's when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned and found Naomi, Thomas's youngest granddaughter, maybe 14, in a floral dress too big for her frame. She held a napkin in her hand, folded tightly. Hi, she said quietly. Are you really his godson? I smiled. Yeah, since I was 5. She hesitated, then held out the napkin. He used to write me notes during service, like tiny ones. They always made me feel seen. I kept them all. I unfolded it carefully. Written in his curling script were 6 simple words. You are light, not shadow. Shine. I felt my throat tighten. Naomi looked up at me. Did he write things like that for you too? I nodded slowly. Yeah, but he also made me earn them. She smiled. Sounds like Grandpa. We sat on the stone bench together. 2 people separated by age but connected by the same invisible thread. They didn't talk about you, she said after a pause. Not until today. I asked once who you were in an old photo, and Aunt Marion said you were just a neighbor boy. I laughed gently. I guess that was easier for them to explain. Do you hate them? She asked, without flinching. The question hung in the air for a moment too long. I don't, I said softly, but I stopped expecting them to know who I really was a long time ago. She nodded, as if that answer made sense to her. I want to know more. If you ever want to tell me stories about him. I smiled. I'd like that. Inside. The party was winding down. Chairs scraped. The caterers began stacking plates. Marion still hovered by the dessert table, watching me like I was a puzzle with one too many pieces. I walked back inside and approached her. She stood tall, arms folded. I didn't know, she said, before I could speak. About the trust. About the chair. About any of it. I believe you. Her voice softened slightly. He should have told us. Maybe he did. I replied. Maybe you just didn't listen. She looked away, embarrassed. I used to think he liked you because you made him feel important, because you needed him. I folded the card and slipped it back into the envelope. He liked me because I listened, even when he had nothing left to give. We stood there for a beat too long, the silence now less sharp, more contemplative. As I turned to leave, she said quietly, "You're welcome here. Now." I nodded, but didn't smile. Thank you. But I don't need to be welcome. I just need to be remembered right. I left the hall with the card in my pocket, Naomi's napkin in my hand, and the weight of something bigger than inheritance following me into the night. Not revenge, not even redemption, just the quiet, undeniable gravity of being seen. The following week, I didn't hear from a single member of the Ellison family. No thank you notes, no follow-up messages, not even a polite photo tag from the reception. The silence didn't surprise me. It was the same kind I'd grown up with: polished, indirect, dismissive. The kind of silence that didn't scream or slap, but erased you quietly, with elegance. But I wasn't waiting anymore. 2 days after the reception, I visited the lawyer's office handling Reverend Ellison's estate, a square building tucked behind an old pharmacy downtown. Ms. Alden, the estate attorney, was a brisk, compact woman with iron-gray hair and a fountain pen always tucked behind her ear. She greeted me like she'd been waiting. "Mr. Carter, the final packet's ready." She handed me a thick folder bound with a green ribbon. Inside was a letter with the Reverend's handwriting. It wasn't sentimental, Thomas never was, but it was clear. To Elijah. If they laugh at the paper, let them. The truth is written between the lines. And then, beneath it, the trust details. An account he had built quietly since I was a boy. Not millions, but enough to change my path forever. Enough for a home. Enough for a future. Enough to matter. I stared at the figures, the footnotes, the phrases like successor rights and education stipends. I felt dizzy, not because I hadn't believed it, but because it was now undeniable, real, paper-clipped and notarized. Miss Alden cleared her throat. He designated you as successor trustee for his community scholarship fund, too. He said you'd know what to do. I nodded, voice caught behind my ribs. I do. Walking out of that office, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not pride, not vindication, something quieter, like a door had closed behind me, and I wasn't locked in anymore. I didn't tell anyone, not right away. Not Naomi, not even my closest friend Daniel. I kept it to myself like a flame cupped in both hands. I wasn't ready for others to blow it out or fan it into a fire I couldn't control. Instead, I went back to my job at the library. I restocked books, helped kids with their research papers, smiled at regulars who didn't know or care who I was in someone else's family tree. Until one afternoon, about a week later, A familiar voice called out from the second-floor balcony. Elijah. I turned. It was Marian. She was holding a small stack of books and wearing the same kind of guarded expression she had at the reception. Not hostility, just habit. I didn't know you worked here, she said, approaching slowly. I shrugged. Been here 3 years. She looked around. Awkward. I'm meeting Naomi. She said you help her with homework sometimes. Sometimes, I said. She's bright. Marian exhaled, rubbing the corner of one book. She's been asking more questions lately. About Dad. About you. She deserves answers. She deserves more than I gave her, she admitted, her voice softening. Maybe we all do. I waited. She hesitated, then extended a small package wrapped in soft blue paper. He left this in his desk, with your name on it. I just didn't want to face it until now. I unwrapped it slowly. Inside was an old photo in a wooden frame. Me, age 8, standing next to Reverend Ellison on the church steps. He had one hand on my shoulder, and I was holding a paper dove we'd made in Sunday school. On the back, scrawled in his familiar ink, he already flies, just doesn't know it yet. I stared at the photo, then back at her. Marian blinked, looking down. I didn't come here to ask for anything. Good, I said, not unkindly, because I have nothing to give you, except memory. She nodded once, tight. That's more than we gave you. Naomi appeared moments later, her backpack swinging from one shoulder. She smiled when she saw me. Ready? Marian stepped back. I'll wait downstairs. We walked toward the study table near the window. Outside, the sun glinted through the leaves, casting slow-moving shadows across the floor. Naomi opened her textbook but didn't look down. She's trying. A little. I know. You believe her? I believe time does strange things to people. She was quiet for a moment. You're different than them. I'm not trying to be. I hope I'm different too. I looked at her seriously. You already are. That evening, after the library closed, I sat on the church steps alone where the photo had been taken. The building was empty now, hollowed out by Thomas's absence, but I could still feel him, not like a ghost, like breath in old wood, like gravity in quiet places. I opened the envelope again and reread the baptism card. I remembered how I used to trace the letters with my finger as a kid, memorizing the loop of every E and the curve of the J. He had written it the night before the ceremony. He once told me, said he wanted to give me something that couldn't be sold, thrown away, or outgrown, something that looked foolish to people who only valued glitter. They had laughed, once, when I brought it to a family picnic. Said it looked like a child's thank you note. Said I should have had a certificate printed like the others. But it wasn't just a card. It was a vault, a compass, a claim. Now, years later, it had become the map back to my place in the story. I didn't need applause. I didn't want their envy. I wanted what I had always wanted, to be known, to be remembered as someone who mattered not because of noise, but because of presence. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. Saw you on the community board? You're doing the scholarship thing for real. I replied, yeah, deadline's next month. Already got 10 essays. He sent back a thumbs up, then proud of you. Man, always knew you had something in that card. I smiled, tucked the photo and the envelope back into my bag, and stood up. It was getting dark, but the path was clearer now, not because they finally saw me, but because I had always been real even when they looked away. 3 weeks later, the church bulletin featured something new. Tucked between a bake sale announcement and a blood drive schedule was a single sentence in bold: applications open now for the Reverend Ellison Memorial Trust Fund overseen by Elijah Carter. It was surreal to see my name in print, especially next to his. I hadn't told many people I was relaunching the scholarship. I didn't need their validation. I wanted quiet submissions, real stories. And they came. By the end of the first week, I had 23 envelopes stacked neatly on my kitchen table. Each one was handwritten, sealed, addressed to Mr. Elijah Carter. Some had neat cursive, some had nervous misspellings. A few came with drawings, photos, or pages smudged with ink, where someone had pressed too hard with a cheap pen. I read them slowly, one by one, night after night. A high school girl whose mother worked 2 jobs and still brought her to choir practice. A young man trying to leave the gang he was raised into, hoping for a second chance. A girl who dreamed of being a pilot, though her father insisted women shouldn't fly. Each voice was sharp, brave, unfiltered. And in their hopes, I found pieces of my own story buried, but not forgotten. One night, Naomi helped me sort them by theme: community, resilience, sacrifice. She took the job seriously, eyes narrowed behind oversized glasses. "They write like they already think no one will believe them," she said quietly. I nodded. "Because most people don't." She glanced at me, then said, "But you do." That same week, I received a call from Bishop Mayfield's office. They wanted to invite me to speak at the upcoming Youth Fellowship night. It was a soft ask. "Just a few minutes," they said. "Share something meaningful." I wasn't a speaker. I was the quiet kid who once sat in the back pew with his hands folded, memorizing verses by heart so Thomas would smile and say, "Sharp mind. That one." But this wasn't about speaking, it was about standing. And so I agreed. When the night came, I stood backstage while the youth choir finished their final song. My palms were damp. I hadn't told anyone I was doing this. Not Daniel. Not Naomi. Not even the few cousins who had started replying to my texts again. The MC introduced me in a polite tone: Elijah Carter, a lifelong member of our extended church family and trustee of the Reverend Ellison Memorial Fund. No applause, just a few coughs, shifting feet. I stepped into the light. The podium was too tall, the mic a little too low, but I didn't adjust anything. I just looked at the sea of faces, some young, some familiar, some skeptical, and I told the truth. "My name is Elijah," I began, "and I was baptized right here. The same wooden bowl, the same old piano. Some of you don't remember me. That's okay. Most of my life, I've been the one just outside the room." A flicker of stillness moved through the crowd. "I brought my baptism card today." I held it up. It's handwritten. No gold foil, no certificate. Most people laughed when they saw it, said it wasn't real. A few people exchanged glances, remembering. But it was. I continued. It was a promise, and it came with something no one could see: a future, a trust fund, quietly built, quietly protected, by a man who saw something in me before anyone else did. I paused. "Now, that fund is yours." A hush fell over the room. Not just the money, the belief, the faith that someone like you, quiet, overlooked, underestimated, has something worth investing in. "I'm not here to give a speech. I'm here to invite you back to the table." And then I stepped down. No music, no clapping, just silence. But it was the right kind. Naomi found me in the hallway afterward, a stack of handouts in her arms. "You didn't sound nervous," she said. I was, well, you didn't sound like it." A pause. "Some of them cried," she added. I looked at her. "You saw that?" She nodded. "Especially the ones who never get picked for anything." We walked out into the night together. The streetlights hummed. Somewhere nearby, someone played a hymn on an out-of-tune guitar. And for once, I didn't feel like I was walking away from something. I felt like I was finally walking in. The following morning, I received an email from a name I didn't expect: Diane Ellison, Thomas's sister, the aunt who used to brush past me at Christmas without making eye contact. Subject: the card. Her message was short. I found an old note in my brother's handwriting. It mentioned your name and said, "He'll never need to shout to be heard. I think I owe you lunch. My treat." I didn't respond right away, but I saved the message. And a week later, I met her at a quiet cafe 2 towns over, where no one knew either of our names. She came in with a cane and a fur-lined coat, but her eyes were softer than I remembered. "I always thought he was wasting his energy on you," she said, cutting into her toast. "Thought you'd disappear the moment he was gone." I sipped my coffee, waited. But here you are, doing what none of us expected. "That tends to be how I work," I said. She smiled. "You're your own sermon." Elijah. He knew that. That's why he never preached over you. Later, as we walked out to the parking lot, she said, "You'll outlast their noise. All of it. They talk too much. You. You just keep showing up." I let her words sit quietly between us. In the following months, the scholarship fund grew. Small donations came in. Local businesses asked to sponsor a student. A retired teacher offered to help read applications. Naomi made flyers by hand and posted them in libraries, laundromats, corner stores. It wasn't big, but it was real. And slowly, the laughter that once met my name faded into something else: respect without noise. Presence without apology. All from a card they said wasn't real. All from a seat they said wasn't mine. Spring arrived quietly that year, like a hand resting gently on your back. I noticed it first in the blooming trees behind the church, where purple crocuses pushed stubbornly through the soil like they'd never even heard of winter. I was standing outside with Naomi, pinning the last scholarship flyer to a crooked bulletin board, when I realized how long it had been since I'd felt cold, not just on my skin, but in my chest. "You think anyone will tear it down?" she asked, smoothing the paper. "Probably," I said. "But we'll just put up more." We'd made over 50 copies by then on recycled paper, with a black and white photo of Reverend Ellison smiling in his garden, holding a watering can in one hand and a Bible in the other. Naomi had drawn vines twisting around the text in pencil and insisted we keep them in every version. "People notice when something feels personal," she said, "even if they don't understand why." She was right. That weekend, we received our 100th application. Daniel came over with a 6-pack of root beer and 2 pizzas to celebrate. We sat on my floor, surrounded by stacks of manila envelopes, eating and reading and laughing at inside jokes no one else would get. He held up one essay and said, "Listen to this. I'm applying because I've spent my whole life feeling like someone else wrote the script, and I want to hold the pen at least once." Damn. Elijah, these kids are writing with fire. I nodded, but I didn't say anything for a moment. I was holding an application from a boy named Caleb, age 17, who wrote about losing his father to addiction and his mother to exhaustion. His final paragraph simply read, "I don't expect to be chosen. I just needed someone to know I tried." I folded it gently, set it aside, and wiped my eyes before anyone could notice. Daniel leaned back. "You okay?" "Yeah, just seeing pieces of myself in every corner lately." He looked around the room. "This feels like what you were always meant to do." I didn't answer, but I think he knew what I was thinking. This wasn't a mission. This wasn't revenge. It was repair. A month later, we held the first official award ceremony in the church garden, the one Thomas had tended himself for over 20 years. The azaleas were blooming. The benches were worn but clean. The podium was borrowed from the community center and had a scratch down one side. No one tried to hide. Naomi wore a white dress and stood beside me with a clipboard. Daniel handled the audio system. Marian brought folding chairs and a tablecloth. Aunt Diane arranged small bouquets in mason jars, one by one. The family showed up, not all, but some. Some with cautious eyes, others with softened shoulders. The recipients arrived with their parents, or sometimes alone. Some wore borrowed shoes, too tight blazers, thrifted dresses, but all of them had eyes that burned. We gave out 5 scholarships that day. 5 envelopes with their names handwritten in blue ink. 5 moments where hope became something you could touch. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't prepare anything. I just walked to the front, the breeze tugging gently at the papers in my hand, and looked at the faces that had once turned away from me. I was told once, I said, that silence can be a wound, but it can also be a seed. A few people shifted. For years, I was quiet because I thought I had no place. Today, I'm quiet because I finally do, and I want these young people to know that their stories matter before the world tells them they don't. Then I stepped back. That was it. The longest silence followed, but not the cold kind, the reverent kind, the kind that lets something take root. Afterward, people lingered, the way they do when something has shifted but no one knows what to call it. Naomi handed out programs with trembling hands. Marian hugged one of the recipients. Aunt Diane cried behind her sunglasses. Daniel came up behind me, nudging my shoulder. Think he would have been proud I didn't answer. I didn't have to. That night, I walked Naomi to her mother's car. She looked up at me, suddenly serious. Why do you think he picked you? I thought about it. Maybe because I didn't ask to be chosen. I just stayed. She nodded. I'm glad you did. Then she leaned in and hugged me quick, like she didn't want to make a big deal of it. I watched her car drive away. The garden was almost empty. The folding chairs sat crooked in the dusk. But I didn't feel alone. I felt steady. Weeks passed. Life returned to its pace. The scholarship winners sent thank you notes. One of them stopped by the library to show me her new student ID. Another called crying from a used laptop she bought with the award money. Each moment felt like a thread sewing something invisible back together. And then one morning, I received a letter. No return address. Just my name on the envelope. Inside was the original church guest list from the baptism reception, the one that hadn't included my name. My name was now written in the margins, in bold, thick pen strokes, and circled twice. Underneath, a note. Some tables weren't ready for you, so you built your own and made room for others. There was no signature, but I knew the handwriting. It was Marian's. I folded the paper and placed it inside the same envelope that had once held my baptism card. One day, I would give it to someone else. Someone younger. Someone still standing outside. Someone still waiting for a name tag or a seat or a voice to call them in. Until then, I would keep building, keep listening, keep showing up, not to prove them wrong, but to prove that I was always right to stay. Summer came slowly that year, like someone unsure whether they were welcome. The days stretched longer, but the nights were still cool, and every sunset felt like it lingered for a reason. The garden behind the church kept blooming, overgrown in some corners, wild in others. I left it that way on purpose. Reverend Ellison used to say, anything too manicured starts forgetting how to grow. The scholarship recipients wrote back more often than I expected. One sent a photo of her standing outside her dorm room door, keys in one hand, the other raised in a trembling thumbs up. Another mailed me a poem. One came to the church and just sat beside me on the bench without saying a word. He stayed for over an hour. Sometimes that was enough. I hadn't heard much from the Ellison family since the ceremony. A few polite messages, a postcard from Marion when she visited her son at college, an email from Diane asking how Naomi was doing in school. But mostly, they kept a respectful distance like guests who'd finally realized the house wasn't theirs to rule. It was fine. I didn't need their closeness anymore. I had something better. That July, Naomi's school held a writing contest. She entered with an essay titled "The One Who Stayed Outside." She didn't tell me until it had already been submitted. She won second place out of more than 200 students. I asked her why she hadn't told me sooner. "I didn't want you to read it and try to protect me from how honest it was," she said. "The essay was about me, about the garden, about how some stories are kept in pockets until the right hands reach for them. It wasn't sentimental. It was sharp, kind, true. You're a better writer than I ever was," I told her. She smiled. "You were never trying to impress anyone. That's why it worked." That weekend, I invited her and Daniel over for dinner. Nothing fancy: pasta, bread, lemonade in chipped glasses. Naomi brought brownies that didn't quite set in the middle. Daniel brought a Bluetooth speaker and played an old gospel album that made us laugh. "I swear," he said between bites, "this house smells like Reverend Ellison's place, like books and old flowers." I glanced around, probably because half his books are on these shelves. "You ever think about moving?" he asked. "You could go anywhere now." I looked at the windows, the worn rug, the small kitchen with the crooked cabinet door. "No," I said. "This place was built for staying." Naomi wandered to the bookshelf and pulled out a photo album. "Is this your baptism picture I walked over?" "That one." "Yeah." She stared at it for a long time. "You looked like you already knew." "Knew what?" "That it was going to be complicated." I laughed. Even at 5, I guess I had a feeling. She turned the page. Another photo: me and Thomas planting a sapling in the corner of the garden. He's holding the shovel. I'm holding his sleeve. "Do you think he knew how much this would change everything?" she asked. "I don't think he cared about changing everything," I said. "He just wanted me to believe I wasn't invisible." A long pause. "You're not," she said. One night in late August, I returned to the church to water the garden. The hose had a slow leak and the nozzle was cracked, so the water came out in spurts. I didn't fix it. It reminded me of childhood, of the way Reverend Ellison would say, "Use what leaks." It's honest. I was trimming dead leaves when I heard footsteps on gravel. A woman approached, wearing a plain blouse and carrying a photo frame wrapped in a towel. It was June Thomas's middle daughter, the one who had barely spoken a word to me since his funeral. "I thought I'd find you here," she said. I nodded. Not many places to look. She unwrapped the frame and held it out. "I found this behind one of Dad's old dressers. I think it's yours." It was a photo I hadn't seen in over a decade. Me, at around 10, standing behind the pulpit with a toy microphone, pretending to preach. Thomas sat in the front pew, laughing, hand on his heart. "I remember this," I whispered. "He said you always wanted to teach," June said. I wanted to understand. She looked at me. Her eyes weren't soft, but they weren't cold either. "I didn't get it back then," she admitted. "Why he was so protective of you. Why he wrote to you more than to us. I used to think it was favoritism." I didn't respond. "But now I think it was recognition," she continued. "You reminded him of himself, quiet, serious, searching." She held out the frame. I took it. "I'm sorry we laughed at your card," she said. I looked at her. It wasn't just a card. "I know that now." She started to walk away, then paused. "You know, if Dad had written that card for me, I would have thrown it away when I turned 12. Thought it was embarrassing." I smiled faintly. Then maybe he knew exactly who needed it. She nodded. Maybe he did. The garden began to wither by early September. Leaves crisped at the edges. Flowers turned inward, but the roots held strong. That's when Naomi called me, her voice breathless. You got a letter. From the mayor's office. I came home to find her on the porch, holding the envelope like it might explode. Inside was an invitation, a city ceremony to honor community figures who had created lasting impact through quiet transformation. I didn't want to go, but Naomi insisted. You always talk about how invisible people don't get recognized, she said. Well, they're recognizing you now. You don't have to pretend it doesn't matter. So I went. The ceremony was simple. Speeches, applause, potted plants instead of trophies. When they called my name, I stood under a banner that read, "Building what was missing." And for once, I didn't feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow. I felt like I'd become the light. Later that night, after the ceremony, I returned to the garden one last time before winter. The moon was full. The bench was empty. The air was cool enough to sting a little. I sat with the framed photo of me and Thomas on my lap. The card folded neatly in my coat pocket. The world had changed. Not loudly. Not all at once. But undeniably. They had laughed at my baptism card. They had rolled their eyes at the paper without a seal. But I had stayed. And beneath their laughter, beneath their silence, beneath their assumptions, I had built something unshakable. Not a family tree. A root system. Not to prove I belonged, but to remind them I always did. Autumn fell hard that year, with sharp winds and a sky that always looked like it was on the verge of crying. Leaves littered the sidewalk in crunchy patches, and the air smelled like damp wood and distant smoke. I liked it better that way when the season changed so unapologetically, you couldn't pretend nothing was different anymore. I spent most afternoons at the library again. Routine suited me. Naomi came after school twice a week to help organize scholarship files. And Daniel would sometimes swing by during his lunch breaks just to sit quietly across from me with a sandwich and an unopened book. One Friday evening, as I was locking up, I noticed someone sitting on the library steps. At first I thought it might be a student waiting for a ride, but as I got closer, I realized it was Caleb, the boy who'd written, "I just needed someone to know I tried." He stood when he saw me, shoulders hunched like he wasn't sure whether to stay or run. "Hey," I said. "Hi," he murmured. I didn't know where else to go. I nodded toward the bench. "Want to sit for a minute?" He hesitated, then followed. We sat in silence for almost a full minute before he spoke again. "I used part of the scholarship money to buy my brother a coat," he said. "His old one didn't have a zipper anymore." I looked at him. "That's a good use. I also got new boots. And a cheap phone. But I didn't tell anyone at school about the scholarship. I didn't want them to think I got it out of pity." I leaned back, exhaling. It wasn't pity. Caleb. It was recognition. He stared at the pavement. "I still feel like I'm waiting for someone to come take it back." "They won't." He glanced sideways at me. "You ever feel like someone's going to tap you on the shoulder and tell you all of this was a mistake?" I almost laughed. Every day for about 10 years. He let out a soft breath, almost a smile. "You know what helped?" I said. He shook his head, realizing that you don't need to be afraid of losing something if you've already decided it was never about having it, it was about carrying it. He frowned. "What do you mean? That coat you bought your brother. That choice. That's the legacy. That's what no one can take away." He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. "Okay." He stood, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and paused. "Thanks for sitting. Thanks for not running." After he left, I sat on the bench a while longer, watching the wind pull at the branches, scatter the leaves, lift trash into spirals. I thought of Reverend Ellison sitting under that same sky years ago, telling me, "The world doesn't care how loud you are, Elijah. It only remembers where you stood when it mattered." I didn't need to be remembered. I just needed to keep standing. In mid-October, I was invited to attend a board meeting at the local high school to discuss expanding the scholarship program into an annual mentorship project. I brought Naomi with me. She was, technically, still a student, but I figured her voice deserved to be heard. She wore a gray blazer she borrowed from her mom and carried a notebook filled with scribbles and arrows and underlined words like accountability and access. The boardroom was stiff, the air cold from overused air conditioning, and the men at the table looked like they'd never once written their own speeches. One of them glanced at Naomi's notes. "This is very passionate," he said. She straightened. "It's also very practical." They didn't argue, but they didn't smile either. After the meeting, as we walked down the school's brick steps, Naomi turned to me. "Do you ever get tired of pretending not to be insulted?" I smirked. "Only when I forget I've already outlived their expectations." She didn't laugh, but her shoulders relaxed. "You did good in there," I said. "I'm tired of saying things people don't expect me to say." "Good. That means you're exactly where you need to be." Later that month, I received an invitation to speak at Reverend Ellison's alma mater, a small, ivy-covered seminary tucked in the hills outside of town. They wanted to honor his legacy with a lecture series and asked if I'd give the opening talk. I almost said no. I wasn't a theologian. I wasn't ordained. I hadn't even finished college. But something inside me, maybe stubbornness, maybe memory, nudged me forward. So I went. The hall was beautiful. Wooden beams, stained glass windows, rows of pews instead of chairs. I stood at the front, behind a heavy pulpit that smelled of lemon oil and incense. "My name is Elijah Carter," I said, "and I'm not the son of a preacher. I'm not the product of ministry. I'm the result of being believed in when there was nothing visible to believe in." I held up the card. "This is my baptism card. It's not laminated. It doesn't have a church seal." But inside it was something no one could see until it grew into something they couldn't ignore. I talked for 10 minutes, maybe 15, about silence, about doubt, about the kind of faith that isn't loud, but endures. When I finished, the room didn't erupt. There was no standing ovation, just stillness. But one older man in the front row stood up, slowly, and said, "He did well." Reverend Ellison would have said that twice. It was enough. Naomi turned 16 in November. Her mom threw a small party at home streamers. Pizza, a homemade cake that collapsed slightly in the center. I brought her a secondhand leather journal and wrote inside the cover, "You are already the story they will one day quote. Keep writing." She read it, nodded once, and tucked it under her arm like a secret. After the party, Marian pulled me aside. She had an envelope in her hand. I expected it to be a thank you card. It wasn't. Inside was a photocopy of Reverend Ellison's will. She tapped the last page. "You never asked to see the whole thing," she said. I thought, maybe now you should. I scanned it quickly. There, in the last clause, written plainly to Elijah, "I leave not only the trust, but the right to be known in my name not as a beneficiary, but as a witness." I looked up. Marian wasn't smiling, but her face was calm. "You earned that." "I didn't do it to earn anything." "I know," she said. "That's why you did." The garden froze in December. The leaves fell for good. The roots dug in deep, and the ground went quiet. I visited anyway just once, just to stand in it. I wore my heaviest coat, boots caked in slush. The bench was cold, the soil unmovable. But I wasn't there to change anything. I was there to remember what had already changed. The laughter had faded, the doubts had dissolved, and the card, the little, handwritten card, had become something none of them could mock anymore. It was a beginning. It was a blueprint. It was a door. And I had walked through it. January settled in with gray skies and the kind of cold that numbed your fingertips before you had time to notice. The church garden, once so full of late blooms and quiet growth, now lay beneath a thin crust of ice. Naomi called it the season of invisible roots. She said it like a poet, half meaning it, half testing how it would sound out loud. I spent most mornings at my desk in the library. The windows fogged over by noon, and I found a strange comfort in watching people pass by without ever looking in. There was a time I might have felt invisible in moments like that now. I just felt free. One morning, as I was sorting returns, the door creaked open, and I heard a voice I hadn't expected. Elijah. I turned. Standing near the front shelves was a woman I hadn't seen in years. Her name was Miss Corinne, an old friend of Reverend Ellison's, and the Sunday school teacher who used to give me graham crackers for every question I got right. She looked smaller than I remembered. Her once springy curls now silver and pulled back under a wool hat. But her eyes, those alert, no-nonsense eyes, were just the same. "I hoped you'd still be here," she said, walking over. "I didn't want to call ahead. Just wanted to see you like people used to. No fanfare. No need for it," I replied, smiling. "Sit with me." We took the corner table by the heater, the one where sunlight pooled like warm tea on clear days. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thin notebook. The pages were yellowed and full of slanted cursive. She pushed it toward me. "I kept this," she said, "after Thomas passed. It's a journal he gave me years ago to help document moments that matter. Most of them are just scraps of thoughts, sermon ideas, but some are about you." I stared at it. She tapped the page. "This one here. Dated the week after your baptism." He wrote, "Elijah doesn't need loud faith. His strength is that he listens to silence and still hears God." My throat tightened. "I figured it belonged to you now," she said. I ran my hand across the paper, the ink slightly raised where the pen had pressed hard. I could see him in that sentence in the way it didn't flatter, just stated. Quiet truths for quiet people. "I used to think he only wrote those things to encourage me," I said. Miss Corinne smiled gently. "He did. But he also wrote them because he didn't want to forget what he saw in you. That's different." I closed the notebook slowly, like I was afraid it might dissolve in my hands. She reached over and placed her palm on mine. "Don't spend your life proving you were worthy of the space he made for you," she said. "He made it because it was yours already." That night, I went home and reread every page. Some were sermons half-formed. Others were prayers written like letters. But scattered in between were fragments about me. E. reads the Psalms like they're maps. Gave him a magnifying glass today. Watched him examine the cracks in a stained glass window for 20 minutes. Asked if broken glass could still tell a story. He listens like the world has a secret just for him. I wept. Not loudly, just quietly, the way I always had. Not because I felt sad, but because I'd never really known how much someone had watched me when I thought I was invisible. By February, the scholarship committee expanded. We had 6 new volunteers, 3 teachers, a retired social worker, Naomi, and Daniel. Of course, I gave them access to the applications and let them form their own rubrics. I didn't want the selection to be about me. It had never really been about me. Still, they asked me to give final input on the top 10. One afternoon, we sat in the library conference room, the table buried in folders. Naomi passed around tea in mismatched mugs while Daniel used a dry erase board to jot down names and reasons. One teacher, Mrs. Allen, held up an application and said, "This one, she's got the lowest GPA of the group, but her essay made me cry." Naomi smiled. "She's got fire, not polish. I like that." Another volunteer nodded. "She reminds me of someone." They all looked at me. I raised an eyebrow. "What?" Daniel grinned. "You don't see it." I shrugged. "You were never the loudest," he said, "but you had something that stuck, like a handprint on wet concrete." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I just nodded. In the end, we chose 5 new recipients. When I called the girl with the lowest GPA to tell her she'd been selected, she went silent for almost 20 seconds. Then she said, "Are you sure I thought I wasn't enough?" I said, "You're exactly enough. We didn't need numbers to see that." Her voice cracked. "Thank you for reading what I wrote." "Thank you," I said, "for writing it." In March, I received a letter from a lawyer I didn't recognize. I almost didn't open it, but when I did, I froze. Inside was a copy of Reverend Ellison's land deed specifically for the garden plot behind the church. There was a postscript in typed script per Mr. Ellison's final amendment. "This land belongs to Elijah Carter on the condition it remains open to the public, and especially to those who have nowhere else to sit." The paper shook in my hands. It wasn't money. It wasn't fame. It wasn't even a house. It was something better. A place. A piece of earth where no one would be asked to leave, where cards weren't laughed at, where names weren't crossed off guest lists, where you didn't need a title to belong. That spring, I planted new wildflowers in the garden. Naomi chose the colors. Daniel helped dig. Volunteers came and went, some bringing shovels, some just sitting on the bench for a while in silence. One afternoon, a teenage boy wandered in while we were working. He didn't speak, just sat cross-legged by the far fence, watching. After a while, he picked up a trowel and started digging without being asked. Naomi whispered, "Should we say something?" I shook my head. "He's already saying it." The boy came back the next day, and the next. Eventually, he spoke. "My brother told me about this place," he said it's the only spot in the city where people don't expect you to explain who you are before they let you in. I smiled. He was right. He grinned shyly. "You really built it because of a card?" "Not because of the card," I said. "Because someone believed the card meant something." He nodded slowly. "Cool." And then he went back to digging. I kept the baptism card on my nightstand. The ink was barely visible now, and the edges had curled from years of touch, but it hadn't faded. Not really. It had just settled, like roots, like memory, like the kind of truth you don't need to prove anymore because the garden, the lives, the letters, the laughter, the silence, they all prove it for you. April arrived not with a bang but with a gentle unfurling petals pressing open, birds returning with cautious songs, and the unmistakable scent of soil rising up in the morning air. The garden woke slowly, and so did I. I found myself waking earlier than usual. I'd sit on the edge of my bed, the baptism card still resting on the nightstand, and let the light filter through the blinds before even thinking of breakfast. Mornings had become a kind of ritual. Quiet clothes, black coffee, a slow walk to the garden. It was never about what I had to do next. It was about listening to what didn't need to be said anymore. Naomi joined me most mornings now. She was getting older fast. In that way teenagers do when grief, honesty, and ambition converge. She'd bring her sketchbook and sit under the same sycamore tree Thomas once read scripture beneath. Sometimes she drew the garden. Sometimes she drew faces. But most of the time, She just sat with a kind of focus that didn't beg for attention. One morning, as we sat side by side on the bench, she asked, "Did you ever think about quitting giving up the scholarship fund, the garden, the whole thing?" I didn't have to think long. Yes. When? When I realized no one was going to apologize. She nodded. They still haven't. I know. And you're okay with that? I let the wind speak for a while before answering. I had to decide what meant more, an apology or a legacy. One makes you feel better. The other makes other people better. Naomi looked down at her sketchbook. That sounds like something Reverend Ellison would say. It probably is, I admitted. She tore out the page she was working on and handed it to me. A charcoal drawing me kneeling beside a rose bush, its thorns pronounced, its petals just beginning to bloom. "I want you to have this," she said. "Why?" "So you'll remember what you looked like when you didn't flinch." I didn't say anything, just tucked the drawing into my coat. Later that week, I received a call from Diane. Her voice was slower these days, soft around the edges. "Elijah," she said, "I've been thinking about creating something lasting, not big, just personal. I don't want the Ellison name to be remembered only in stained glass windows." "What do you have in mind?" "I want to write a book," she said. "A small one. Family memories, photos, pieces of him that live outside of sermons." I smiled. That sounds like him. "I want you to write the introduction." I paused. "Are you sure the family would want that? I'm not asking them," she replied. "I'm asking you." It took me 3 days to write it. I didn't talk about legacy or theology. I didn't mention trust funds or scholarship boards. I wrote about Thomas's hands, how they were always slightly ink-stained, how he tied his shoelaces too tight and never unlearned it, how he believed in handwritten notes over printed ones, how he whispered when he meant something. I sent it to Diane without editing a word. She called me an hour later, crying. In May, the City Council invited us to present the scholarship initiative as a pilot model for other districts. Naomi and I worked on the slideshow together. She insisted on using her own drawings instead of stock images. "They need to see it's real," she said. "They will." The day of the presentation, we arrived early. Daniel met us there, dressed in his one good suit, pretending not to be nervous. I wasn't. I'd stopped performing for rooms that weren't built for me. Now I just stood in them. We presented our numbers. We told our stories. I read Caleb's quote out loud, the one about someone knowing he tried. Naomi shared her drawing of the garden gate, opened slightly. We ended with a photo of Reverend Ellison mid-laugh, mouth open, eyes squinted, joy unfiltered. The room clapped, not loudly, but sincerely. Afterward, a council member approached me. "I remember when they said you didn't belong at the reception," she whispered. "Now you're rewriting the invitation list." I didn't respond, just nodded. The work had begun to speak louder than the wounds. On the last Saturday of May, I held the second annual scholarship garden gathering. No microphones, no stage, just folding chairs, homemade lemonade, string lights, and the smell of fresh mulch and honeysuckle. This year, I added a small table near the entrance on it, a guest book and an open envelope marked "Your Card." People were invited to write their own promises to themselves, one sentence only. Fold it, seal it, keep it. Naomi came up with the idea. I asked her why. "Because not everyone gets a card like yours," she said. "But everyone deserves to start something that matters." By sunset, the table was overflowing. Messages like "I forgive myself for being small when I was afraid," "I am not too late," "I will be my own beginning." People hugged, laughed, sat in silence. No one asked who was in charge. They just knew. Marian arrived near the end. She wore her hair down this time. Softer. More human. She didn't speak at first, just watched the garden like it had once belonged to her, and now she was learning to admire it from the outside. Finally, she approached me. "You built something we were too proud to imagine. You imagined it," I said. "You just didn't believe it could come from me." She nodded slowly. "I'm starting to believe a lot of things now." I offered her the guest book. "Want to write something?" She did. Later, I saw her entry. He never needed the name. He was the root we ignored. June arrived hot and heavy. Storm clouds pressed against the sky like secrets too long withheld. I sat on the garden bench one evening, watching the wind shift the tall grass. Naomi sat cross-legged nearby, writing in her notebook. "Will you ever leave this place?" she asked suddenly. "Maybe," I said, "but I'll never leave what it gave me. And what's that life that wasn't handed to me but still felt like mine?" She didn't speak, just nodded. I reached into my coat and pulled out the baptism card, the edges now nearly transparent. I held it out to her. She stared at it. "You're giving it to me." "No," I said. "I want you to draw a new one, a version that looks like what it became." She blinked. "Like a redesign?" "No, not a redesign. A remembering." She took the card, cradled it like glass. "I'll start tonight." As we sat there, dusk pressing in, the cicadas humming their endless song, I realized something I hadn't before. It was never about the card. It was about the child who didn't throw it away. It was about the man who never let its meaning die. It was about the people who came later, saw the dirt under the nails, the roots beneath the laughter, and decided they wanted to grow something too. It was never about recognition. It was always about remembrance. And now, it was no longer just mine. It belonged to the soil, to the silence, to whoever sat in the garden next, wondering if they were enough, and hearing the wind say back, "You always were." The summer deepened. Long days gave way to longer twilights, and the garden breathed in gold. Light touched everything differently now, soft, diffused, as if even the sun had learned to listen. Naomi's redesigned baptism card was finished. She handed it to me wrapped in brown paper, folded twice, sealed with a thin strip of string. We sat on the library roof that evening, legs dangling over the edge, the world below humming in the thick August heat. Her hands fidgeted with a pencil cap while I unwrapped the card. It wasn't flashy. It didn't shimmer. It didn't try to impress. It was quiet like the original, but deeper. The background was a pencil sketch of two hands, not holding, just reaching across a field of uncut flowers, and in the center, the words, "To the one they didn't expect, thank you for staying." I didn't speak for a long time. She watched me. "Is it okay?" I nodded, voice thin. "It's more than okay. I wanted it to feel like memory, not ceremony." "It does." She tilted her head. "You know, we should print these." "For what?" "For the kids who think no one's writing them into the story." I looked down at the drawing again. "They'd have to believe it," I said. She smiled. "They will." We stayed on the roof until the sky turned the color of ashes and the first stars blinked through. I thought of how far this all had come, from a folded card in a trembling hand to an entire roof filled with stillness that no one could take away. September came with ceremony. The third class of scholarship recipients was announced. This time, we added letters personal, handwritten, folded neatly, and placed inside each acceptance envelope. Naomi wrote 2 of them herself. She said it felt better than sending a check alone. Daniel organized the garden event. Diane returned with more stories and brought a photo album full of Reverend Ellison's old pocket notes, tiny, cryptic, written in margin-sized script on napkins and hymnals and receipts. One of them read, "When you build a door, Don't forget to sit beside it sometimes. I posted it by the garden gate. That afternoon, during the event, a woman approached me wearing dark sunglasses and a quiet posture. Her name was Janice. She'd been one of the people who laughed at my original baptism card decades ago, before I even understood why it hurt. She stood with both hands clasped around a mason jar of lemonade, eyes down. "I owe you an apology," she said. I nodded, unsure whether to make it easier for her. "I thought the card made you look small. I didn't see it for what it was." "What was it?" I asked. She hesitated, then said, "Proof that he saw you." The wind moved lightly through the tall grasses. "I'm glad you didn't burn it," she added. "So am I." Then she did something that surprised me. She handed me a small envelope. "I made a donation," she said. I wrote a note inside. "You don't need to read it now." She walked away before I could answer. I opened it later that night. The check was modest. The note was not. "Thank you for not becoming who we expected. Thank you for becoming better." The weeks passed. Leaves began to drop. The edges of the garden curled brown. Naomi got accepted into a pre-college writing program, and when she told me, her eyes were wide but steady. "I think I'm scared," she said. "That's how you know you're standing at the beginning of something true," I told her. She smiled. "You'll keep the garden going while I'm gone. Always." Daniel offered to take over some of the paperwork. Diane started cataloging old sermons. Marian joined the scholarship reading committee. Slowly, without ceremony, the circle began to close around something new. Not me, not my story, but the work itself. The soil, the silence. The belief passed forward. One morning, I returned to the bench before dawn. The sky was thick with fog, the world still asleep. The garden was half dreaming, leaves barely stirring, flowers slouched with the weight of the season's end. I sat down and reached into my coat. The original card was there, fragile, frayed at the corners, the ink no longer fully legible. I held it against my chest and breathed. I didn't need it to be readable anymore. I had memorized what it meant. For 20 years. It had been mocked, doubted, almost discarded, but it survived. Quietly. Like me. And now, it had done something almost impossible. It had grown into others. I stood and walked to the center of the garden, where the soil was darkest and richest. I bent down, dug a small hole with my hands, and placed the card inside. Not to bury it, but to plant it. I covered it gently, patted the earth down, then whispered something I didn't need anyone else to hear. Then I sat again, hands dirty, heart clean. The sun broke slowly through the mist. Light hit the bench, the gravel, the gate. The garden wasn't blooming anymore, but it was still alive, still waiting for whoever came next. I didn't tell Naomi I had planted the card. I didn't need to. 2 weeks later, she sent me a photo from her dorm room. Above her desk was a print of the redesigned card. In the corner, she'd written, "This story belongs to more than one heart now." I smiled and wrote her back. It always did. "Winter will come again. Soon. The chairs will be folded. The wildflowers will die back. The soil will harden. But beneath it, the ink will remain. The handwriting. The promise. They once laughed at a card. Now it's part of the earth. And when the thaw comes again, when the first green pierces through, it won't be loud. It won't be obvious. But it will be alive. And this time, no one will mistake it for nothing." The first snow came overnight. Soft, clean, deliberate. I woke to a world silenced by frost. The garden, now reduced to shapes beneath white, looked like a sculpture of itself. Even the bench had disappeared beneath a smooth blanket, untouched but waiting. I bundled up and walked there anyway, boots crunching over the frozen path. It felt like instinct more than habit. Some mornings, even silence demands your presence. I stood by the gate for a long time, breathing slow. In the spot where I'd buried the card, the snow had settled evenly, as if the earth was guarding what I'd given it. I didn't need to dig. I didn't need to check. Some things, once trusted to the ground, do not need witnesses, they grow in the dark without needing proof. As I turned to leave, I noticed something taped to the wooden post near the garden entrance. A note, lined paper, blue ink. I found the guest book. I wrote my promise. I didn't sign it. I hope that's okay. I'm not ready to be known yet, but I think this place sees me anyway. No name. Just that. I folded it and tucked it into my coat. The next day, I installed a small wooden box near the entrance, just below the sign that read, Reverend Ellison Memorial Garden. Naomi had painted the sign before she left for school. It was crooked, but beautifully so. I nailed the box in gently and painted 3 words across the front in white. Leave something true. Within days, it was full. Notes, sketches, prayers, receipts with sentences scrawled on the back. One letter simply said, "This is the first place I've stood without shrinking." I began collecting them once a week, archiving them in a binder back at the library. Not to publish, not to display, just to keep safe. They weren't testimonies, they were roots. And roots don't demand to be seen to matter. Daniel came by that weekend to help salt the walkway. He brought coffee and an old radio that barely worked. "They're still coming?" he asked, nodding toward the box. "More every day." He grinned. "You realize you've become the guy people write confessions to?" I smirked. "Only because I answer with silence." We shoveled snow in comfortable quiet. Afterward, we sat on the bench, steam rising from our coffee cups, our breath visible and slow. "You ever think of stopping?" he asked suddenly. "Stopping what, all of this? The garden, the letters, the fund? Living your whole life as the keeper of something other people forgot how to value?" I looked at him for a long time before answering. "No," I said. "Because I was given something when I didn't know I needed it, and it stayed with me. I owe that back." Daniel nodded, his face a little tired. "You ever wish it had come easier? I used to. And now I'm grateful it didn't. Things earned quietly, never wrought." He didn't speak after that, just leaned back and watched the sky. A few weeks later, I received a letter from Naomi. It wasn't long, just a folded sheet of notebook paper tucked inside a bookstore envelope. They asked me in class what my most formative memory was. Everyone else said first kisses or family vacations. I said a garden with no gatekeeper, a man who buried a card instead of bitterness, and the sound of my own name said without question. She drew a small flower at the bottom, just one bloom, open. I pinned the letter beside the guest book in my office. Sometimes I'd glance at it between meetings, between calls, between planning the next round of scholarships. It reminded me why the work was never really work, why the garden wasn't a project, but a presence. That spring, the garden bloomed early. The snow melted into the roots like a secret finally spoken aloud. The rose bushes grew with force. The forget-me-nots Naomi had planted behind the bench came back fuller, clustered like memory clinging to itself. One morning, I came out to find someone had added something, a small wooden plaque, carved by hand, fixed into the soil just left of center. It read, "Planted in silence, grown by truth." No signature, no date, but it belonged. Instantly. That evening, I hosted a walkthrough for the new scholarship applicants and their families. Instead of speeches, I invited them to wander, to sit, to read the notes from the Leave Something True box. No one asked questions. No one needed to. As they drifted through the space, I watched one young man stop at the plaque. He stared for a long time, then knelt, touched the edge of the wood, and whispered something I couldn't hear. I didn't need to. The garden had heard him. Later that month, Marian invited me to dinner. Just us. No hidden agendas, no committee obligations. We ate on her back porch, surrounded by potted herbs and the faint echo of wind chimes. She'd made vegetable soup and lemon bread. Everything tasted like memory softened with time. I wanted to say something, she said as we cleared the plates. I waited. You were right, about the difference between apology and legacy. I looked up. She continued, voice low. Even I spent years thinking the family name needed protecting. Turns out, it needed releasing. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting. I said, no, but it does mean forgiveness, even the kind no one earns. We sat for a while, watching the light disappear behind the neighbor's rooftop. Sometimes I wish Dad had told us, she said, about everything he left you. He did, I said. You just weren't listening then. She nodded, without defense. And now I hear it in your voice. June arrived with full green. The garden no longer looked like a memory, it looked like breath. Alive, not sacred, just steady. And still. The box filled each week with pieces of strangers becoming known. I opened one that read, I walked in just to cry. I left believing I could stay. Another said, no one told me quiet could be holy. And another, written in a child's blocky letters, I want to be like the person who made this. I folded each carefully, stored them like seeds, and every time I closed the lid on the box, I thought of that first day, standing outside the reception, holding a card no one believed in, waiting to be let in. And now the doors were open. Now the paper had grown. Now the boy they had laughed at was no longer waiting for a seat. He was making space for others, one root at a time. By late June, the garden had grown too large to tend alone, not just in size, but in meaning. What had once been a tucked-away space behind a forgotten chapel was now something people whispered about during morning coffee runs, mentioned during school board meetings, brought up at counseling sessions and across dinner tables. I didn't plan for that. I hadn't built it to be seen. I'd built it to be felt. But now, feeling had a ripple, a place that once knew only footsteps, now knew footprints. One morning, I found a group of teenagers sitting in a circle by the elder tree, passing around a guitar and taking turns singing songs they'd written. Their voices cracked, not always in tune, but the honesty was undeniable. I didn't interrupt. I just watched from the garden's edge and listened. When they noticed me, one of the girls stood. She had a patch sewn onto her jacket that said, "Speak when ready." We didn't know if this space was allowed for stuff like this. She said, "It is." I replied, "Whatever heals without harm is allowed here." She nodded, then sat again. The music resumed. The next song was about silence. That same afternoon, I received a letter from Naomi. She'd passed her final exams with high marks and was offered a fellowship at a summer writing residency on the East Coast. She wanted to go, but asked if I'd still be there when she returned. "The garden feels like something I made in a dream," she wrote. "And you feel like the only person who understood the dream before I could speak it." I wrote back, "I'm not going anywhere. Some roots are permanent." By early July, we began preparing for the next round of scholarships. This time, we had over 200 applicants. The team had grown to 10 volunteers, each trained, each trusted. The process was quiet, methodical. Nothing was rushed. Every name mattered. Daniel suggested we rename the fund. "You've earned that much," he said. "It doesn't need to be Reverend Ellison's alone." I thought about it, sat with the idea for days, even asked Diane what she thought. She smiled and said, "He always believed you'd take the torch. Now you're planting torches all over the place." In the end, I didn't change the name, but I added a line beneath it, "Curated by those who were once overlooked." Because that was the truth. We weren't a committee. We were a memory system. A second chance for those who had once slipped through the cracks simply because they didn't shine in the right direction fast enough. Then, in mid-July, something unexpected arrived. A thick, beige envelope with a gold seal, no return address. Inside was a typed letter from a publishing house. They'd heard of the garden through a series of posts circulating on a niche community blog. People had started referring to it as the place of letters. Someone had even written a short essay about the box labeled "Leave Something True," and it had made its way across online forums, slowly gaining momentum. The publishing house wanted to collaborate. A book. Not about me. Not even about Reverend Ellison. A book built from the anonymous letters left in the garden. They proposed a simple structure, one note per page, grouped by theme: grief, identity, hope, rebirth. They'd hire an illustrator to accompany the words with gentle sketches. They didn't want to commercialize it. They wanted to honor it. I sat with the letter for a week, read it, reread it, wondered if it would ruin what made the garden sacred. Then, one night, I pulled out the old binder of letters, the ones I'd carefully archived, week after week. I flipped through them, one by one. My name was taken from me at 13. This place gave it back. I didn't come to heal. I came to sit. But I left feeling ready. No one told me that stillness could be a kind of prayer. I wrote this while crying in the corner. But now I'm smiling. There were hundreds like it. Not polished. Not literary. But true. Unmistakably true. And I realized something: they weren't mine to keep. They were ours to share. So I wrote back to the publisher. Agreed. With one condition: no names. Ever. Not even mine. The project began immediately. Naomi offered to design the chapter dividers. Daniel collected permissions where possible. Diane suggested we print 100 copies just for the local library systems, free of charge. The rest would be available online, with proceeds going directly into the scholarship fund. We titled it "Planted Words Letters from the Quiet Garden." By August, the first proof arrived. I held it in my hands for a long time. The cover was soft matte, pale green with white line drawings of petals and folded paper. Inside, the letters were printed in thick, clear type, spaced generously. Nothing crowded, no commentary, just voices, breathing without interruption. On the dedication page, it simply read, "To those who stayed when no one clapped, to those who wrote when no one answered, to those who grew without permission." I brought it to the garden that evening and laid it gently on the bench. And then I waited. One by one, visitors arrived. Not because I called them, but because they always came when the silence needed company. That fall, Naomi returned. Taller somehow. Older in the way that experiences age you without hardening you. She walked into the garden holding a satchel full of paper and a soft expression I'd come to trust. She knelt by the rose bush and touched the soil where the original baptism card had been planted. "Anything grow here?" she asked. "Everything," I said. She smiled and held out a new card. Folded. Hand-drawn. A gift. "I made this for the next person." I opened it. Inside, it read, "They may not see you, but this place already has." I felt something shift in my chest. Not pain, not pride, recognition. That she had become the new keeper. Not because I passed the title, but because she had stepped into it naturally. I placed the card in the guest book box. It was time. And so, as the garden settled once more into the rhythm of changing leaves, I stepped back, not out, just back, letting others kneel in the soil, letting others read the letters, letting others speak the quiet truths that had once nearly drowned inside my chest. The card had become the soil had become the space had become the story, and I had become the quiet witness, no longer waiting to be seen, no longer needing to be named, just here, rooted, present, still turning paper into life, still turning laughter into legacy, still turning silence into shelter.